Amelie never thought she would step into the Nkosi mansion again. The tall gates, the glittering lights, the smell of wealth in every corner, it all reminded her of a life she had walked away from. The invitation had arrived out of nowhere, written in gold ink, asking her to join Christmas dinner with her estranged husband's family. Everyone whispered that it was a trap, that they wanted to see her broken, maybe even force her to sign the divorce papers in front of them all. But Amelie didn't flinch. She dressed simply, carried herself with quiet grace, and in her hands she held a small red gift box. No one knew what was inside. The dinner table was as cruel as it was grand. Crystal chandeliers glowed above while the family sparkled in designer clothes. Laughter circled around her like knives. Mandla sat proudly with his new girlfriend, Zinel, who flashed a diamond bracelet with a smirk. Amelie sat at the far end, silent but unshaken. Then came the bet. Mandla's uncle raised his glass and declared she would cry once the papers were shown. The family laughed, hungry for her humiliation. When the lawyer slid the documents across the table, Mandla leaned forward. "Sign, Amelie. Free us both," he said, his eyes sharp with triumph. But Amelie did not cry. Instead, she placed the red box on the table. "Before I sign," she said softly, "Merry Christmas." Inside were legal papers transferring power, money, and control into her hands. The room froze. "You bet on my tears," she said, standing tall. "I came with receipts." The Nkosi mansion shone like a palace that night. Golden lights poured from crystal chandeliers, reflecting on marble floors polished so bright they looked like mirrors. The long dinner table was covered with silver trays, golden cutlery, and plates so delicate they looked untouched by real hands. Laughter filled the air, but it was sharp and thin, not warm. Every smile at that table was painted on, every word coated with sugar but meant to sting. Amelie sat at the far end, quiet and composed, her posture straight, her hands resting lightly on her lap. Her dress was simple, nothing like the glittering gowns around her, but it was her calm that made her stand out. The family whispered as if she couldn't hear, though their voices carried easily across the wide room. Some chuckled, some leaned in to whisper cruel jokes, others just stared as though waiting for her to break. She kept her eyes down, but she felt every gaze, every smirk. Mandla sat proudly near the head of the table, his face glowing with confidence. Beside him was Zinel, his new girlfriend, who leaned against him like a queen showing off her throne. Her wrist sparkled with a thick diamond bracelet, and she lifted her arm again and again, letting the stones catch the light as though the whole room needed reminding. She glanced at Amelie with a sly smile, a look that said, "I won. You lost." The conversations around the table moved quickly, but Amelie barely heard them. She heard only the laughter aimed her way, the coughs that covered insults, the small gasps of mockery. Even the grandmother, who had once been kind, could not look her in the eye. Every moment was thick with expectation, as though the family were waiting for a show to begin. Their smiles never reached their eyes. Their hands tightened around their glasses. Amelie sat still, breathing slowly, her heart heavy but steady. She could feel the red gift box resting against her leg under the table, its edges firm beneath her fingertips. They thought they had set the stage for her humiliation. They thought she had walked into their trap. She said nothing, showed nothing, but inside she carried a secret weight far greater than their cruel games. The dinner continued with false cheer, voices rising and falling like music rehearsed too many times. Yet every person in the room, even the servants passing plates, knew that the night was building toward one moment, the moment everyone was waiting for. And though Amelie appeared small and silent at the far end, the truth sat in her lap, ready to change everything. The food on the table looked like a feast from a magazine, but Amelie could barely taste a thing. She sat in silence, letting the chatter and laughter swirl around her like smoke. Every now and then, Mandla's eyes cut across the table to her, sharp and mocking, as if he already knew how the night would end. Zinel leaned closer to him, whispering something into his ear that made him laugh loudly, a laugh meant for Amelie to hear. Still, Amelie did not move. Her hand rested gently on her lap, fingers brushing against the smooth red box, the only thing grounding her in that glittering cage. Then, out of nowhere, Mandla's uncle, a man with a booming voice and a belly full of arrogance, lifted his glass high. "Let's make this dinner interesting," he announced, his words slicing through the room. Every conversation stopped. All eyes turned toward him. With a smirk he declared, "I bet she'll cry when she sees the papers." His tone was dripping with mockery, as if Amelie were not a woman but a circus act brought in for their amusement. The table erupted in laughter. Some slapped the table, others clapped as though it was the cleverest joke they had ever heard. Zinel threw her head back and laughed too, her diamond bracelet flashing under the chandelier, as if mocking Amelie with every sparkle. Even the grandmother, the one person who had once treated Amelie with kindness, lowered her gaze, unable to meet her eyes. That silence hurt more than the laughter. Amelie felt the weight of every stare pressing against her skin, but she did not break. She sat tall, her expression calm, almost unreadable. Inside, her heart pounded, but outside she was a statue of grace. She pressed her fingers lightly against the red gift box, reminding herself of what she carried, of why she had come. Let them laugh now, she thought. The laughter died down when the family lawyer stepped into the room. He carried a sleek black envelope in his hands, his expression serious, as if he too enjoyed the performance about to unfold. The room buzzed with anticipation, whispers rushing from one side of the table to the other. Everyone knew what was coming. Amelie watched as the envelope was placed carefully on the table, right in front of Mandla. The moment had arrived, the one they had all been waiting for. She could feel the storm building in the room, but still she did not move. Her hand never left the red box. She was ready. The lawyer placed the envelope on the polished wood, his hands slow and deliberate, as though he wanted the moment to stretch and sting. With a faint smile, he pulled out the stack of papers and slid them across the table, the sound of paper on wood echoing louder than the laughter that had filled the room just minutes before. The documents stopped right in front of Amelie, their weight heavy though no one had touched them yet. Every head turned her way. The entire table leaned in, hungry for the scene they had been waiting for. Mandla smirked, his eyes cold and shining with victory. He tapped the papers with one finger and spoke in a voice that carried across the room. "Sign now, Amelie. Free yourself, and free me." His tone was cruel, mocking, as though he was offering her a gift when in truth he was pressing her into a corner. Zinel shifted in her chair, leaning back comfortably as if she were settling into a theater seat to watch the show. She crossed her legs, flicked her diamond bracelet into the light, and smiled like a queen about to watch her rival crumble. The air in the room grew thick. No one touched their food. No one even sipped their wine. All eyes were fixed on Amelie. The uncle who had started the bet leaned forward with his glass, eager to see if his prediction would come true. The cousins whispered behind their hands, already smiling, already ready to laugh again. Even the grandmother, stiff and silent at the head of the table, finally looked up, her eyes heavy with something like guilt but her lips pressed shut. Amelie lowered her eyes for a moment, her face unreadable. Her hand brushed the edge of the papers but did not lift them. To the family, it looked like hesitation, like the first crack in her armor. Mandla smirked wider, Zinel's smile deepened, and the whispers around the table grew louder, feeding off the expectation. They wanted her to beg, to cry, to plead for mercy. They wanted her to fall apart in front of them. But Amelie remained still. Her fingers left the papers and moved slowly back to her lap, pressing against the red box she had kept hidden there all evening. She could feel its edges against her skin, sharp and solid, reminding her of what she carried. Her face gave nothing away, not fear, not anger, not even sadness. She simply sat there, letting the silence grow heavy, letting them believe she was weak. Inside, her heart was steady. They were waiting for her tears. What they didn't know was that the real performance had not even begun. The room was holding its breath, waiting for Amelie to collapse. Mandla leaned back in his chair, sure he had already won. Zinno rested her chin on her hand, her smile sharp, her eyes locked on Amelie like a hunter watching prey. The lawyer kept the papers in place, his pen ready, as though he were about to guide a child's hand across the page. But Amelie didn't move toward the papers. Instead, with a slow grace that made the whole table pause, she reached beneath the table and lifted the small red box she had carried all evening. She placed it gently on the polished wood in front of her. "Before I sign anything," she said softly, her voice steady, cutting through the silence like glass, "Merry Christmas." For a moment, the room erupted in laughter. Mandla's uncle slapped the table, wheezing as if it was the funniest thing he had ever heard. A few cousins giggled into their glasses. Zinno rolled her eyes and whispered something mocking into Mandla's ear. Even Mandla chuckled, shaking his head, amused at what he thought was her desperate attempt to distract them. But the laughter didn't last long. When the box was opened and the lid lifted, the air shifted. The chuckles died one by one until the room fell completely silent. Inside the box was not a trinket, not a plea for pity, but a stack of documents. Thick, stamped, and signed. Ownership papers. Stock transfers. Bank account freezes. Official seals glared up at them, undeniable and final. The lawyer blinked, leaning forward to check, his face paling as he realized the papers were real. Mandla's smirk froze on his lips. He reached forward with shaking hands, flipping through the documents, his eyes widening with each page. What is this?" he muttered, his voice suddenly stripped of confidence. Amelie sat tall, her eyes calm, watching them all unravel. No one had known. No one had seen the quiet moves she had made behind the curtain. She had worked in silence with Mandla's former business partner, a man who had been betrayed and cast aside by the Nkosi family. Together, they had shifted power piece by piece until much of the empire no longer rested in Mandla's hands but in hers. Every face around the table turned pale. The uncle who had made the cruel bet stopped laughing, his glass shaking in his hand. Zinno leaned forward, her smile gone, her eyes darting from Mandla to Amelie as though searching for someone to tell her it wasn't true. The grandmother dropped her fork, the sound ringing through the room like a bell. Amelie did not gloat. She only folded her hands neatly on the table and let the silence linger. They had expected her to break. Instead, she had come to break them. The silence after the box was opened was so deep it felt like the walls themselves were listening. No one moved, no one breathed. Amelie rose slowly from her chair, her presence suddenly larger than the glittering chandeliers above them. She rested her hand on the stack of documents, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the tension. "You bet on my tears," she said, her eyes sweeping across every face at the table. "Instead, I came with receipts." Her words landed like a slap. For a second, the family didn't react, as if their brains needed time to process what they had just heard. Then, all at once, the room erupted with gasps and mutters. Mandla's smirk collapsed, his jaw tightening as he flipped through the documents again, desperate to prove them fake. But the lawyer, stiff in his seat, cleared his throat and spoke in a low, careful voice. "These are legitimate. Every signature, every seal, they're binding. Legally binding." The words struck like thunder. The empire that had always seemed untouchable, too powerful to crumble, was suddenly hanging by a thread, and Amelie was the one holding that thread between her fingers. The same woman they had mocked, underestimated, and bet against now stood as the one person who could bring their world crashing down. Mandla's face drained of color, his lips parting in disbelief. He pushed the papers away as if they burned his skin. "No. This is impossible," he whispered, though his voice shook, betraying the fear he could no longer hide. Zinno gasped loudly, her hand flying to her chest as if the diamond bracelet on her wrist had turned to chains. She looked at Mandla in horror, as though realizing the throne she thought she had claimed was nothing but sand slipping through her fingers. At the far end of the table, the grandmother, who had kept her silence through most of the night, finally reacted. Her fork slipped from her hand and clattered loudly onto her plate. The sound rang across the room, breaking the last illusion of calm. Her eyes widened with shock, but she said nothing. Perhaps she understood more than the rest, perhaps she saw in Amelie the strength she had always overlooked. Around the table, the once proud family looked smaller now, their arrogance collapsing under the weight of Amelie's quiet power. The cousins who had whispered and laughed earlier now stared in disbelief, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others avoiding Amelie's gaze entirely. The uncle who had started the cruel bet sat frozen, his glass of wine trembling in his hand, his earlier laughter choking in his throat. Amelie did not raise her voice, did not gloat. She stood tall, her calm presence louder than any scream could have been. In that moment, the truth was undeniable, the Nkosi family had underestimated her, and now their empire belonged not to Mandla, not to his proud lineage, but to the woman they had tried to destroy. The room exploded the moment the lawyer confirmed the truth. Mandla shot up from his chair, his voice breaking into a furious shout. "This is impossible. Do you hear me? Impossible." He grabbed the papers again, scanning them as if his eyes could somehow change the words printed on them. His face was pale, sweat forming on his forehead, the confidence he carried all night gone in an instant. Zinel pushed back her chair so hard it scraped against the marble floor. Her diamond bracelet, once shown off proudly, now looked useless as she stormed toward the door, her heels striking like thunder. "I won't be a part of this mess," she hissed, humiliated, before disappearing into the hallway. The uncle who had started the cruel bet slammed his glass on the table, red wine spilling like blood across the white cloth. How could this happen? Who let this happen? His voice boomed, but underneath it was panic. He turned on Mandla, demanding answers, his face red with anger and fear. The cousins began to argue too, voices rising, accusations flying across the glittering table as if the golden cutlery and crystal glasses meant nothing anymore. The grandmother sat frozen, her lips trembling, her eyes filled with something that looked like regret. She opened her mouth as if to speak but no words came. The once grand and united family, who had built their night around humiliating Amelie, was now falling apart in front of her eyes. Every mask they had worn, smiles, laughter, confidence, had shattered. Through the chaos, Amelie remained untouched. She rose slowly, her movements calm and graceful, as though she had already planned this moment in her heart. Her dress was simple, but in that storm of shouting and breaking pride, she looked like the only one who still had dignity. She walked past the long table without a word, ignoring the voices, ignoring the stares. Her eyes searched for one thing only. In the corner of the room, the nanny held her daughter, a small child who had been shielded from the ugliness of the night. Amelie reached out and took her into her arms, holding her close, whispering something soft against her hair. The little girl wrapped her arms around her mother's neck, safe and unaware of the storm she was leaving behind. Without looking back, Amelie began walking toward the door. Behind her, the Nkosi family was unraveling, their empire shaking not from an enemy outside but from the woman they had tried to destroy. Voices rose, plates clattered, accusations grew louder. But Amelie didn't need to see it. She knew the damage was done. Their power was broken, their masks gone. And she was free. The cold night air wrapped around Amelie as she stepped out of the mansion, her daughter held safely in her arms. Behind her, the heavy doors closed, muffling the angry voices that still echoed through the Nkosi dining room. Inside, plates were breaking, people were shouting, and the once powerful family was tearing itself apart. But outside, everything was quiet, except for the sound of fireworks blooming in the dark sky. Bursts of red, green, and gold painted the night, their light reflecting in her daughter's wide eyes. Amelie paused for a moment on the steps, looking up. The cold air brushed against her face, but she felt nothing but warmth inside. She leaned close to her daughter and whispered softly, "Sometimes the best gift is the one they never saw coming." The little girl smiled sleepily, resting her head on her mother's shoulder, safe and content in her embrace. Behind those walls, the Nkosi family's laughter had died. The bet that was meant to humiliate her, to strip her of dignity, had instead destroyed their pride and shaken their empire. Amelie had walked in carrying only a red box, and now she walked out with her power, her child, and her silence. She took one last glance at the glowing mansion before turning away. For years, it had been a place of pain, of whispers and control. Tonight, it had become the place where she reclaimed herself. As fireworks cracked above her, Amelie stepped into the night with steady feet and a heart finally free. There was no need for revenge in her eyes, no need for anger. Her silence was enough. It was her victory, and it was complete.